This is a work of fiction. All characters, events, and military operations depicted are entirely fictional. The thing about running a dog kennel in the Ozarks is that nothing interesting ever happens at a convenient hour. Interesting happens at 2 in the morning, in the rain, when you're standing in mud up to your ankles, wondering why you didn't just buy a hardware store in Tulsa, like Hatch told you to. Nolan Voss heard the engine first. Not loud. Careful. Someone easing up the gravel road with their headlights cutting through the rain like they weren't sure they wanted to be found. He set down the water bucket he'd been carrying to the last run and stood still. Listened. The kennel dogs hadn't barked yet, which meant whatever was out there wasn't close enough. Or wasn't human. The headlights reached the gate, held there for 5 or 6 seconds, then went dark. No door opened. No voice called out. Just the engine idling, and then the slow crunch of tires pulling away. "That's not nothing," Nolan said to no one, because there was no one. There hadn't been anyone for a while, unless you counted the 7 dogs in his care, and Nolan counted them plenty. He crossed the yard toward the front gate, flashlight in hand. The rain had that particular spring heaviness to it, warm enough that it didn't sting, cold enough that it soaked through a jacket in under a minute. His left knee complained on the slope. It always complained on slopes. 18 years of jumping out of perfectly good aircraft will do that to cartilage. The gate was closed, padlocked, nothing out of place. Except for the dog. He was standing about 10 feet past the fence line, just off the gravel, in a patch of grass that the rain had turned to soup. German Shepherd. Dark coat, though the darkness and the rain made it hard to tell how dark. Thin. Much too thin. Ribs pressing against wet fur like fingers under a sheet. He had a collar, but it was wrong. Not worn through or lost. Cut. Someone had taken a blade to the strap and sliced it most of the way through, leaving just enough to keep it hanging around his neck like an afterthought. Nolan pointed the flashlight lower, keeping the beam out of the dog's eyes. The dog didn't bolt. Didn't come forward either. Just stood there, watching him. And Nolan recognized the expression because he'd seen it before. On people, mostly. The look of someone who'd stopped expecting anything good, but hadn't quite given up yet. Hey now. He crouched slowly. The dog pulled back half a step, a low growl building in his chest. It wasn't aggressive, more like a reminder that trust was not currently on the table. Yeah, I get it. I'm not a fan of strangers either. Nolan sat down in the mud. Just sat there, flashlight resting on his thigh, rain running down the back of his neck. He'd learned this a long time ago. Not in the Air Force, not in any pipeline or school. He'd learned it from his first dog. A mutt named Captain, who'd spent 3 weeks under a porch before deciding Nolan was worth the risk. You don't chase. You don't reach. You sit and you wait. And you let the dog decide you're not the worst thing that's happened to him today. 3 minutes, maybe 4. The rain filled the silence between them, making everything else quieter by comparison. The German Shepherd took 1 step forward, then another, close enough that Nolan could smell the wet fur and something sharper beneath it. Chemical. industrial, like he'd been kept in a space that wasn't built for animals. His nose touched Nolan's knuckles, cold, quick. Then he pulled back, studied him, and came forward again. "All right," Nolan said. "All right, let's get you inside." He stood slowly. The dog followed, not close, but following, which was enough. He opened the gate and walked him to the intake area at the back of the kennel building. Dry towel, fresh water, a bowl of kibble that the dog sniffed for a solid 30 seconds before eating, carefully, like someone had taught him that food could be taken away. Nolan dried the dog as much as the dog would allow, which wasn't much, and checked him over. Male, maybe 5 years old, well-muscled under the weight loss. Scars on the insides of both ears that looked surgical rather than accidental. Teeth clean and maintained. This wasn't a stray. This was a working dog who had been worked hard and then, by all appearances, discarded. He pulled the microchip scanner from the shelf and ran it over the back of the dog's neck. The chip registered, but what came back on the reader was not a standard veterinary record. No name, no owner, no vaccination history. Instead, the screen displayed a string of alphanumeric characters, 42 digits long, structured in blocks of 8. It looked like an encryption header. It looked like that because, as Nolan would learn in about 24 hours, that's exactly what it was. He tilted the scanner, read it again. Same result. That's not a vet chip. The dog looked up from the bowl, ears forward, watching him with dark, measured eyes. Outside, the rain came down harder, and somewhere on the road below, the sound of the engine had long since disappeared into the valley. Tyler Pratt showed up at 8 the next morning driving a Honda Civic that looked like it had been through 2 states without stopping. Missouri plates, but the registration sticker was expired by 3 months. The windshield had a crack running from the passenger side all the way to the rearview mirror. A crack you stopped noticing after the first 1,000 miles, because fixing it would require money you didn't have for things that still technically worked. The kid, and Nolan called him a kid because 24 looked young when you were 44, and because something about the way Tyler Pratt moved reminded Nolan of people who hadn't yet learned how heavy the world actually was. Stepped out of the car like he was carrying something heavier than the duffel bag over his shoulder. He was lean, sandy-haired, with a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in about a week, and eyes that moved too fast. Scanning the kennel, the tree line, the road behind him. Then the kennel again. Nolan knew that scan. He'd done it himself for years. Still did most days, though these days there was usually less to scan for. The scan said, "I am looking for threats." The speed of the scan said, "I expect to find one." "Help you?" "Yeah, I think you have my dog." Nolan leaned against the doorframe of the kennel building. The morning was cool, the air thick with the smell of wet cedar and the particular freshness that Missouri gets after a long rain. Somewhere behind him, 3 of the kennel dogs were having an argument about breakfast that was getting personal. Describe the dog. German Shepherd, male, dark coat, about 80 pounds. Should be 80 anyway. He was 80 when I last... The kid stopped, swallowed. His name's Echo. Echo. Nolan let the name sit for a second. And your name? Tyler. Tyler Pratt. Tyler Pratt. And how'd your dog end up at my gate in the middle of the night with a collar someone took a knife to? The kid's face did something complicated. Surprise, then shame, then a kind of exhaustion that went deeper than sleep could fix. It's a long story. I've got coffee and nowhere to be. Start with the short version. They sat in the kennel office, which was generous terminology for a room with a desk, 2 chairs, and a filing cabinet that Nolan used mostly as a table for his coffee maker. The room smelled like kibble and pine cleaner, which was an improvement over what it had smelled like when Nolan bought the property. Mildew and regret, roughly in equal measure. Tyler held his mug with both hands. He talked like a man assembling a story out of pieces he wasn't sure fit together. And Nolan let him assemble it, because rushing a scared person into coherence never produced anything useful. He'd done enough casualty interviews downrange to know that the truth comes out in its own time, and that pushing just makes people edit. Tyler had been a canine handler, not military, private. A company called Ridgeline Solutions that contracted with the federal government for security services, canine teams, facility protection. Big outfit. Tyler said they had contracts with DHS, DOD, a few agencies he wasn't cleared to name. He'd worked their canine division for 2 years, handling detection dogs at checkpoints, warehouse inspections, border facilities. Echo was my partner. Trained together, deployed together. Well, not deployed. Assigned. They don't call it deployed when you're private sector. And then what happened? Tyler's grip tightened on the mug. The ceramic made a faint sound against his ring finger. 3 months ago, they discharged me. Dishonorable conduct. Said I'd been abusing Echo. Rough handling, aggression, failure to follow welfare protocols. He looked up. None of it was true. Nolan watched him, didn't speak. This was another thing 20 years had taught him. Silence is a better interrogator than questions. They moved fast, like 48 hours fast. By the time I tried to appeal, Echo was already reassigned and my credentials were revoked. They wiped my access, my files, everything. He set the mug down. I got him out a week ago. I know how that sounds. It sounds like you stole a dog from a defense contractor. Tyler looked at the floor. Yeah, I guess it does. Nolan stood and walked to the intake run where Echo was lying on the concrete, chin on paws. The dog's ears came up when he heard Tyler's voice from the office. His tail moved once, a single sweep, then still. Recognition without enthusiasm. Like seeing an old friend through a window you couldn't open. Hey, Echo. The dog looked at Nolan, then past him toward the hallway where Tyler sat. Fuss, Tyler called from the office. Heel. The word was German, which told Nolan something. Dogs trained in German commands were usually serious working dogs, law enforcement, or military pipeline. Echo didn't move. He looked at Tyler for a long second, then turned his head back toward the wall of the run. Tyler appeared in the doorway. His face went slack. He doesn't listen to me anymore. Nolan studied the dog. Echo wasn't disobedient. His posture wasn't defiant. It was withdrawn. Ears slightly back, body angled away from Tyler. This wasn't a dog who'd lost his training. This was a dog who'd lost his trust. And Nolan had seen enough handlers, good ones, in places where trust was the difference between going home and not, to know the difference. What happened to him between when you were discharged and when you got him back? I don't know. They reassigned him. When I found him again 3 weeks later, he was different, thinner, reactive. He snapped at two handlers, wouldn't eat unless he was alone. Tyler's voice cracked at the edges. They said I beat him. I didn't. I never touched him. Nolan looked at Echo, then at Tyler. The kid was standing in the doorway with his fists balled at his sides and his jaw working. And for a half second, just a flash, gone before Nolan could hold it, Tyler wasn't Tyler anymore. He was Kyle Beckert, 22, standing in the briefing room at Helmand with his hands shaking after his first contact, saying, "I'm fine, Sergeant, I'm fine." Nolan shut that door in his head. Hard. 3 days. You can stay 3 days. Then you figure out your situation and you move on. Tyler blinked. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. The 3 days come with rules. The microchip bothered him. It bothered him the way a sound in the dark bothers you, when you know it's not the wind, even if you can't prove it. Nolan had scanned hundreds of dogs in 6 years of running the kennel, and every single one had returned a standard record. Owner name, vet clinic, vaccination dates, maybe an emergency contact. What Echo's chip returned was none of those things. He sat at the desk that evening with the scanner readout printed on a sheet of paper and his laptop open to a browser that told him nothing useful. Tyler was outside with Echo, trying to coax the dog into the training yard. It wasn't going well. Echo would follow Tyler to the gate of the run, then stop, stand there, not refusing exactly, but not participating either. Like a soldier following orders he didn't believe in. Nolan pulled up his phone and scrolled to the contact he needed. Hatch. Full name, Gerald Hutchinson, but nobody had called him that since 1998. Retired AFSOC tech sergeant, now doing something with cybersecurity contracting in Tulsa that Nolan didn't fully understand and Hatch didn't fully explain. They'd overlapped 6 months at Bagram, different rotations. The kind of friendship that didn't require regular maintenance, but started back up without a warm-up lap. Hatch. It's Voss. Well, the hermit speaks. Hatch's voice was the same as always, cheerful and suspicious in equal measure. You calling about the thing, or is this social? What thing? I don't know. There's always a thing. That's why you call. Fair. Nolan read him the alphanumeric string from the chip. He read it slowly, twice, spelling out each character. Silence on the other end for about 10 seconds, which was a long time for Hatch. That's not veterinary, Hatch said. That's... More keyboard sounds. Nolan, that's an encryption header, military grade, or close enough that I can't tell the difference from here. Whoever loaded this onto that chip knew exactly what they were doing. Can you crack it? Can I? Of course I can crack it. Eventually. Give me a day, maybe 2. Where did you get this? A dog. A dog. A German shepherd showed up at my kennel last night with this on his chip, instead of vet records. And you just scanned him? Like you routinely scan strays? I scan all the dogs, Hatch. Right, okay. A dog with classified data embedded in his neck. That's a new one, even for you. I'll call you when I have something. After he hung up, Nolan went outside. The rain had stopped, and the evening had that particular washed clean quality that the Ozarks do better than anywhere else. Tyler was sitting on the bottom step of what passed for a porch. 3 steps of treated lumber that Nolan had built himself, poorly, with tools borrowed from the hardware store. Echo lay about 4 feet from Tyler, close enough to be in range, far enough to maintain the fiction of independence. The dog was eating from a bowl Tyler had placed between them, slowly, methodically. Each piece of kibble chewed separately, like a man eating a meal he wasn't sure was real. "He won't come to me," Tyler said, without looking up. "He will, or he won't. Either way, pushing isn't how it works." Tyler turned. "You train dogs for a living, and that's your advice? Wait." "I train dogs for a living, which is how I know that waiting is the only advice worth giving." Nolan sat on the top step. Echo's eyes moved between them, measuring, calculating. It was an unsettling amount of intelligence for an animal, though Nolan had long since stopped being surprised by how much dogs understood. They were better listeners than most people. They just couldn't fake it when they weren't interested. "He's not broken," Nolan said. "He's deciding." "Tyler, the chip in Echo's neck, it doesn't have vet records on it." Tyler looked at him. The confusion was immediate and total. "What do you mean?" "I mean, someone loaded encrypted data onto your dog's microchip. Military-grade encryption. My contact's working on cracking it, but it'll take a day or two." The color left Tyler's face. Not slowly. All at once, like someone had flipped a switch. His mouth opened, closed. "I didn't. I don't know anything about that. I swear." "I believe you." And Nolan did. Tyler's reaction wasn't guilt. It was fear. The specific fear of someone realizing that the thing they'd been running from was bigger than they thought. "But somebody put it there. Before you got Echo back, or before he was reassigned. Who was his handler before you?" Tyler stared at the ground for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had gone flat. "A guy named Webb. Marcus Webb. He was there 2 years before me. Ran Echo from day one." "Where is he now?" "I don't know. Haven't heard from him in 6 months. Tyler looked up. His eyes had something new in them. Not fear this time. Something older. "Nobody has." Nolan exhaled slowly. 6 months of silence from a canine handler who had access to a dog that now carried encrypted military data in its neck. That silence didn't mean someone was enjoying retirement. "That's not good," Nolan said. Echo lifted his head from the empty bowl, ears forward, watching Nolan. For a dog who didn't trust anyone, he had a remarkable ability to look like he was following the conversation. And maybe he was. Maybe Echo knew more about what was on that chip than anyone currently alive. The feed store in Coppervale was called Barton's, and it had been called Barton's since before Nolan moved to the area, which suggested either remarkable brand loyalty or a shortage of imagination. Nolan went in the next morning for dog food. 50-pound bag of the working formula, plus a case of joint supplements that his vet in Springfield kept telling him were overpriced. And Nolan kept buying anyway, because the dogs didn't complain about the price. Marcy Barton, third-generation owner, 62, who knew every animal in a 20-mile radius by name and most of their owners by reputation, leaned across the counter and lowered her voice when Nolan reached the register. "Had a fella in here yesterday asking about a dog." Nolan set his wallet on the counter. "What kind of fella?" "Big. Nice clothes for around here. Drove a black Tahoe with dealer plates. Said he was looking for a German Shepherd that went missing from a security training facility." She made a face that suggested she thought about as much of that explanation as Nolan did. Since when do security facilities lose dogs? They don't. That's what I thought. She rang up his total. He left a card. Want it? Nolan took the card. White, clean, expensive stock. J. Decker, Ridgeline Recovery Services. No title, no phone number on the front, just a name and a company division that hadn't existed when Nolan checked Ridgeline's website the night before. He pocketed it. Thanks, Marcy. Nolan. She caught his arm as he turned. Her face had gone serious in that particular way people's faces go in small towns when they want to help but aren't sure how much of the picture they're seeing. He was asking about you, too. What did you tell him? That you're the best dog trainer in the county and you mind your own business. She let go of his arm. Both of which are true, last I checked. Nolan loaded the truck and drove to the diner. His stomach said so, and his instincts said if Decker was still in town, Lucky's was where you'd find him. Every town has a gravitational center, and in Coppervale, it was Lucky's. A place whose ceiling tiles had seen better decades, whose coffee tasted like it had been brewed during a previous administration, and whose owner, a woman named Dell, who never smiled before noon, kept hours that suggested either dedication or insomnia. Nolan ordered eggs and coffee and sat in the booth nearest the window, back to the wall, where he could see the parking lot and the road beyond it. Old habits. The kind that don't go away because they were never habits in the first place. They were survival architecture. Load-bearing walls you couldn't remove without the whole structure coming down. He was halfway through the eggs when the man walked in. Tall, well-built, in the specific way that said weight room and protein shakes rather than actual field work, though Nolan wouldn't bet his life on that assessment. Mid-30s. Clean shave. Polo shirt tucked into tactical pants, which was a look that announced itself louder than any uniform. You could always spot the guys who'd transitioned from military to private sector by the pants. The pants were always wrong. Too many pockets, too clean, too much, I used to be someone. His eyes swept the room before he sat down. Left to right, back to front, exits noted. Then he smiled at the waitress and ordered coffee like he was just passing through. But his body language said he was settled. Comfortable in a way that meant he'd been here before. Or he'd been in enough places like here that they all looked the same. Nolan watched all of this because he'd spent 20 years learning to watch exactly this. And what he saw was not a civilian. The posture was too controlled, the eye sweep too practiced. The way the man's right hand stayed close to his belt, even while ordering, told a story that the polo shirt was trying very hard to keep quiet. Operator, Nolan thought, or close to it. Former military, probably Army given the build and the posture. Rangers maybe, or at least infantry with some selection school in his background. Current private sector, definitely armed. The kind of man who'd done enough tours to be competent and not enough therapy to be settled. The man got his coffee, took a sip, then turned on his stool. His eyes found Nolan's across the diner, not by accident. He smiled. Easy, practiced. The smile of a man who was good at rooms. Mornin'. You local? More or less. Nice area. Quiet. Decker sipped his coffee. I'm in the area looking for a dog, if you can believe it. German Shepherd. About 80 pounds. Went missing from a training facility a month back. Company I work for is offering a finder's fee. What company? Ridgeline Recovery. We handle asset retrieval for private security firms. Asset retrieval. Nolan noted the phrase. A dog was property. An asset was something you sent men in polo shirts to recover. Haven't seen anything like that around here. I'd notice a shepherd. Decker's smile didn't change. Not even a little. Small town like this, I bet everybody notices everything, right? He set his coffee down. I heard there's a dog training operation up the road. Voss Working Dogs. That yours? It is. Must see a lot of dogs come through. I do. Well. Decker slid a business card across the counter. Same card Marcy had given him. If anything turns up, I'd appreciate a call. The dog is valuable. People want him back. People usually do. Decker held Nolan's gaze for one beat longer than the conversation required. The smile stayed. The eyes didn't match it. Then he nodded, turned back to his coffee, and said nothing else. Nolan finished his eggs, left cash on the table, walked out. In the parking lot, he unlocked his truck and before getting in, checked the side mirror. Decker was standing at the diner window, phone to his ear, looking directly at Nolan's truck. At the license plate. Nolan memorized the Tahoe's plates in return. Then he got in, started the engine, and pulled out without hurrying. Speed limit the whole way home. Not because he was being careful, but because hurrying told people things that Nolan preferred they didn't know. When he got back to the kennel, Echo was lying at the door of the office, chin on the threshold, watching the entrance with a focus that had nothing casual about it. The moment Nolan walked in, the dog's nose bumped his hand. Once. Quick. Like a pulse check. Then he withdrew and lay back down. Yeah, Nolan said. I know. He pulled out his phone and called Tyler, who was in the equipment shed sorting leashes that didn't need sorting. Hey, come inside. We need to talk. What happened? There's a man in town looking for Echo, and he's not from any animal recovery service I've ever heard of. They didn't run. Nolan considered it. Spent about 2 hours considering it while Tyler paced the kennel office and Echo lay between the door and the desk, watching both of them with an expression that suggested he'd seen this kind of human anxiety before and didn't think much of it. Running meant leaving the kennel. It meant leaving 7 client dogs who couldn't feed themselves. It meant looking guilty to whoever Decker reported to. It also meant not knowing where the threat was positioned. And Nolan had learned in places considerably more dangerous than Missouri that the worst tactical position was ignorance. We're not moving. We're hardening this position. Tyler stopped pacing. Hardening? Tripwires, cameras, motion lights, basic stuff. Nobody's getting onto this property without us knowing about it. You think they'd come here? I think they already know we're here, which means the only question is whether we're ready when they show up, or we're not. They spent the afternoon working. Nolan moved through the property with purpose, and Tyler followed, taking direction the way young soldiers do when the person giving orders clearly knows something they don't. There's a rhythm to it. The senior man moves, the junior man watches, and somewhere between the watching and the moving, trust gets built. Or it doesn't. Nolan had seen it go both ways. Tripwire along the south fence line and across both foot approaches from the road. 2 trail cameras covering the gate and the equipment shed, motion sensor lights on the kennel building's east and west corners that Nolan had bought 6 months ago for coyote deterrence and never installed, because installing them would have required admitting that he cared about something enough to protect it. Nothing sophisticated, nothing lethal, just noise, early warning, enough to buy time, which is all early warning ever really buys you.
"Where'd you learn this?" Tyler asked, holding a camera mount while Nolan bolted it to a pine tree. "SIR school. Survival, evasion, resistance, and escape." Then a bunch of places where "sir" turned out to be optimistic about the escape part. Tyler almost smiled at that. Almost. "You were Air Force?" "PJ." The almost smile disappeared, replaced by something more careful. He knew enough to know. "What does that actually mean, like day to day?" Nolan tested the camera angle, adjusted it 2 degrees left. "Means I went to places other people couldn't get to, and brought people back. Alive? When I could." They finished the cameras in silence. The afternoon was warm, spring warmth that felt earned after a long Missouri winter. Tree frogs had started up in the creek bed, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk was circling, patient and unhurried. Tyler took direction well. He listened. He didn't ask unnecessary questions. His hands were steady even when his voice wasn't. And Nolan noticed all of this because his brain had decided, without permission or consultation, to map this kid against the one he'd lost. He was staking a camera mount into the soft ground by the south fence when it happened. The rain had stopped hours ago, but the earth was still saturated, and when his boot pressed into the mud, the smell rose. Thick, organic, and then he wasn't in Missouri. The mud was darker, mixed with something that turned it rust-colored in the wrong light. Helmand Province, 3rd deployment. The road outside FOB Shank, where the convoy had taken the IED. Kyle Beckert was on the ground, 22 years old, 4 months out of the pipeline, still wearing his maroon beret in the field because he'd earned it, and because he was proud, and because he didn't yet know that pride was a luxury in places like this. Nolan's hands were on Kyle's chest. Compress. Hold. Talk. Keep talking. "Stay with me, Beck. Stay with me." The radio. "Cassievac inbound. 14 minutes. 14 minutes. Nolan had counted every one of them because his training said, keep the patient engaged. Keep talking. Keep counting. And because Kyle's eyes were open and watching him. And if Nolan stopped counting, there would be nothing left in the space between them except the truth, which was that 14 minutes was too long for what was happening inside Kyle Beckert's chest. Kyle died at minute 11. His eyes never closed. Nolan had closed them for him afterward, with hands that were steady, because PJ hands are always steady, even when nothing else is. "You okay?" Nolan blinked. The mud was Missouri mud. The smell was cedar and wet grass. Tyler was standing 3 feet away, camera mount in hand, looking at him with an expression that was careful and uncertain, and too familiar. "Fine." Nolan drove the stake into the ground. Hard. "I'm fine." Tyler didn't push it. Smart kid. He went back to his camera mount, and they worked in silence for another 20 minutes while the evening settled over the hills
and the light turned the color of weak tea. The tree frogs had gotten louder. A barred owl started up somewhere in the timber to the north. The "Who cooks for you" call that Nolan had heard every spring since he'd moved here, and that still, every time, made him stop for a second and listen. There were worse sounds to hear at dusk. The flashback had lasted maybe 4 seconds, maybe 5. That was the thing about them. They took up almost no real time and left behind enough weight to fill an afternoon. Nolan's hands were steady. They were always steady. PJ hands. The steadiness was trained in so deep that it lived in his muscles, not his mind, which was convenient because his mind had not been steady for a long time. He looked at Tyler across the yard. The kid was tightening the last camera mount with a focus that was a little too intense for the task, which meant he'd noticed something and was choosing not to mention it. Good instinct. Bad instinct would have been asking again. Worse instinct would have been saying, "I understand." Nobody understood. That wasn't self-pity. It was math. You had to be there for the math to work. And Tyler hadn't been there. When they finished and walked back to the kennel, Nolan found Echo lying on the floor between the office door and the spot where Tyler's duffel bag sat against the wall. The dog wasn't touching either threshold, wasn't guarding either space. He'd positioned himself at the exact midpoint between two people and decided that was where he belonged. His breathing was even. His eyes were open, watching both doorways simultaneously in a way that spoke of long practice. "Look at that," Tyler said. He was almost smiling again. Diplomat. Didn't know shepherds had that in them. They went inside. Tyler fell asleep on the kennel cot within minutes. The hard, total sleep of someone whose body had finally outrun its own adrenaline. Echo lay on the concrete beside the cot, not quite touching Tyler's hand that hung over the edge. Nolan sat in the desk chair, watching them both. The tinnitus was loud tonight, a high, steady hum in his left ear that the VA had rated at 10% disability, and that Nolan rated at constant and significantly worse when someone was looking for his dog. His dog. Already his dog. That had happened fast. 14 minutes, he said to no one. Then he turned off the lamp and listened to the rain start again outside, and to the breathing of a kid who reminded him of someone he couldn't save, and to the silence of a dog who was still deciding who deserved his trust. Hatch called at 6 in the morning, which meant either he'd cracked it or he hadn't slept. Knowing Hatch, both. Nolan was already up. He'd been up since 4:30, which was standard. The dogs needed feeding at 5, the runs needed hosing, and sleep had been optional since approximately 2006. He answered the phone standing in the kennel aisle with a bucket of kibble in one hand and his left knee reminding him that standing on concrete for 20 minutes was no longer a free activity. "Talk to me." "Okay, so, the data on that chip." Hatch's voice had the particular quality it got when he was excited and trying not to show it, which meant he sounded exactly like a man who was excited and trying not to show it. It's not just encrypted, it's structured. We're talking multiple data packets embedded in what looks like a standard ISO microchip format. Whoever did this basically turned a dog chip into a thumb drive. What's on it? 2 things. First, coordinates. 4 sets. Latitude and longitude for 4 locations across 3 states: Missouri,
Arkansas, and Oklahoma. I cross-referenced them. Every single one corresponds to a commercial warehouse or storage facility. These aren't random spots, Nolan. They're distribution points. Nolan set the bucket down. Echo, who had been lying at the far end of the aisle, watching the feeding routine with the detached interest of someone who'd already been fed, lifted his head slightly. His ears rotated forward. Just one at first, then both. Distribution points for what? That's the thing. I can't tell from the coordinates alone. But the file structure suggests inventory tracking. Quantities, dates, transit codes. If I had to guess, and I do, because half of this is still encrypted, I'd say someone was documenting a supply chain, moving product through these locations on a schedule. Product, hardware. The transit codes match NATO logistics formatting. We're talking military equipment, Nolan. Not rifles, not ammunition. Components. Targeting optics, encrypted comms modules, guidance system parts. Stuff that walks off a surplus inventory and ends up in places it shouldn't. Nolan looked at Echo. The dog was sitting up now, watching him with the focused attention of an animal that had been trained to respond to changes in human tone. And Nolan's tone had changed. You said there were two things. Right. Second thing. There's an audio file, still decrypting, but I've got about 40 seconds of clean playback so far. It's a phone conversation. Two voices. One of them is giving instructions, routing, timing, language you use when you're moving things you don't want anyone to see. The other voice is confirming. Do you have a name? I've got a voice. Clear enough for identification. I'm running it through some contacts. Should have a match by tonight, maybe tomorrow morning. Call me the second you have it. Nolan. Hatch's voice shifted. Lighter gone, replaced by the tone he used when he was being serious, which was rare enough that it always landed. Whatever this is, it's not small. If these coordinates are real, and this supply chain is active, you're looking at a federal operation. Multiple agencies. The sort that makes people disappear. People already have disappeared. Webb's been gone 6 months. Yeah, that's what I was afraid you'd say. After the call, Nolan went to find Tyler. The kid was in the training yard with Echo. Or, more accurately, he was in the training yard near Echo, because the dog still maintained that careful 4-foot buffer zone that was simultaneously close enough to say, I know you, and far enough to say, I haven't decided about you yet. Tyler was holding a tennis ball. Echo was not interested in the tennis ball. Echo was lying in a patch of morning sun with his chin on his paws, looking profoundly unimpressed with the concept of fetch. He's not a fetch dog, Nolan said from the gate. I know, I just thought maybe if He's a detection dog. His reward drive is scent work, not retrieval. You want to connect with him, hide something, let him find it. Tyler looked at the ball in his hand, then at Echo. The dog yawned. It was the kind of yawn that contained an editorial. Noted. Tyler, come inside. I need to tell you what we found. The conversation happened in the office. Nolan laid it out the way he'd been trained to lay out operational intelligence. Facts first, analysis second, speculation last. Concise, clear, no emotion in the delivery, because emotion was a distraction when the facts were bad enough to speak for themselves. The coordinates, the supply chain structure, the NATO logistics codes,
the weapon components.
Tyler's face went through several stages. Confusion, disbelief, then a slow, sick realization that settled into his features. Heavy, inevitable, final.
They were using the dog shipments, he said. His voice was quiet, but the words were gaining speed, like a car rolling downhill. The canine transport flights. We moved dogs between facilities every month. Handlers, crates, equipment. It was routine, completely routine. Nobody checked the crates because they were already manifested as canine assets. They had paperwork. They had veterinary clearance. Who's going to open a crate with a military working dog inside it? Nobody. That's the point.
And the weights. Tyler stood up, sat down, stood up again. That's what I reported. The crates were too heavy, 20, sometimes 30 pounds over what a dog and standard equipment should weigh. I filed the discrepancy with my supervisor, a guy named Harlan. He told me he'd look into it. 2 days later, I wasn't an employee anymore.
48 hours.
43. I counted.
Nolan let the silence hold. He'd learned a long time ago that the space after a hard truth is where people either break or reorganize, and interrupting either process never helped. Tyler reorganized. He sat down for the final time and put his hands flat on the desk, palms down, steadying himself. They framed me. The abuse charges, the discharge. It was all to discredit me in case I talked. Yes, and Webb. Webb figured it out first, and he put the evidence in Echo because a dog is the one asset that moves through the system without being questioned. A dog goes where the handler goes, gets scanned, chipped, manifested. But nobody decrypts a microchip. Nobody checks what's actually on it, because there's no reason to. Webb built a lifeboat and put it inside the most loyal creature he had access to. Tyler looked at Echo through the office window. The dog was still lying in the sun, but his ears had shifted, tracking something in the tree line, or maybe just the wind. He built a lifeboat and put it inside his best friend. Yeah, Nolan said. He did. They drove to one of the coordinates that afternoon. Nolan didn't tell Tyler why until they were in the truck. Partly operational habit, partly because he wanted to see the location himself before deciding whether it meant anything. The nearest coordinate was 40 minutes south, off a county road that turned to gravel after the second cattle guard. The warehouse sat at the back of a commercial lot behind a propane distributor. Metal building, maybe 4,000 square feet, with a roll-up door on one end and a standard entry on the other. No signage, no vehicles. The lot was empty except for a dumpster and a stack of wooden pallets that had been there long enough to start growing moss. Stay in the truck, Nolan said. What are you? Stay in the truck. He walked the perimeter. Echo walked with him. Nolan hadn't planned to bring the dog, but Echo had jumped into the truck before anyone could argue, and arguing with a German shepherd who'd made a decision was generally pointless. The warehouse was locked. Standard padlock, commercial grade. No alarm system visible. Nolan walked around back and found what he'd come for. Tire tracks. Recent. Heavy vehicle. Dual rear axle, consistent with a cargo truck. And on the loading pad, a scuff mark in the concrete where something heavy and rectangular had been dragged. Next to it, a piece of packing tape with a partial label still attached. The label read LOT-NTS
2024-0819. NTS. NATO Tasking System.
That's a NATO surplus lot number, Nolan said to Echo, who was sniffing the loading pad with a professional intensity that suggested he found the scent information considerably more interesting than Nolan's commentary. He photographed everything: the tire tracks, the scuff marks, the label, the building from all four sides. Then he walked back to the truck, where Tyler was sitting with his hands on his knees and his face approximately the color of the overcast sky.
"It's real," Nolan said. "Whatever Webb documented, it's happening. And it's been happening recently."
Recently how?
Those tire tracks are less than a week old. This warehouse is active.
Tyler looked at the building through the windshield. "So, what do?
We go home. We wait for Hatch to finish the audio decryption, and then we figure out whose voice is on that recording, because that's the piece that turns this from a weight discrepancy into a federal case." Hatch called back the next morning. Nolan was cleaning runs, and Tyler was attempting, with limited success, to teach Echo a recall command in English. The dog responded to German flawlessly. "Here," and Echo came. "Platz," and Echo dropped. But "come" in English got a head tilt and nothing else, as if the dog understood perfectly well and had decided that cooperation in a second language required additional incentive. "Hatch, I've got the name." No preamble, no joke. That was how Nolan knew it was bad. The voice on the recording. I ran it through 3 separate contacts, 2 military, 1 federal. All 3 came back with the same match. Adrian Foss. The name landed in Nolan's chest, hard, with ripples going outward in every direction. Adrian Foss, Colonel retired, Air Force Security Forces, currently CEO of Ridgeline Solutions, which held contracts with DHS, DoD, and at least 2 agencies whose names didn't appear on public budgets. "You're sure?" Voice analysis confident to 94%. And Nolan. The conversation on that recording isn't ambiguous. He's giving direct instructions. Route the package through the Coppervale corridor. Standard K9 manifest. No deviation from the schedule. That's not a man being briefed. That's a man giving orders. Nolan closed his eyes for a moment. Foss. He'd heard the name before. Not personally. They'd never met, never served in the same unit, never shook hands at a dining facility or shared a ride to a briefing. But Foss had been at Bagram in 2011, running security forces operations out of the main compound, when Nolan was running PJ missions out of a forward base 30 miles south. Different world. Different war, almost, even though the maps were the same. Security forces handled base defense, law enforcement, force protection, the inside-the-wire work that kept the machine running. PJs went outside the wire. The two rarely crossed paths, and when they did, the relationship was professional, distant, and colored by the unspoken hierarchy that exists in every military branch between people who go to danger and people who manage it. But Nolan knew the type. Career officer, political instincts sharper than his tactical ones. The kind of man who made full colonel by knowing which meetings to attend and which to skip, by maintaining relationships with people who controlled budgets, by being useful in ways that didn't require personal risk. He'd seen men like Foss transition to private sector defense contracting with the same inevitability as water flowing downhill, naturally, smoothly, and always toward money. $80 million in government contracts, canine teams, facility security, consulting services, a portfolio that required connections at DHS, DOD, and a dozen other acronyms that most Americans couldn't define. You didn't build that by being honest. You built it by being careful. And men like Foss were very, very careful. Until they weren't. Until the supply chain they'd built required more components than the surplus market could legally provide. Until the shortcuts they'd normalized became the operation itself. Until someone's dog knew more about the truth than anyone alive. Foss runs an $80 million company. DHS contracts, DOD contacts, lawyers, lobbyists, and probably a senator or two on speed dial. We can't touch him with a dog chip and a 40-second recording. No, Hatch agreed. But someone can. I made a call. Quiet, unofficial. There's a reason I said it'd take a day. I wasn't just decrypting. I was making inquiries. His tone shifted, more careful. AFOSI, Air Force Office of Special Investigations, has an open file on Ridgeline Solutions. It's thin, circumstantial, but it exists. They've been looking at Foss for 18 months without enough to move on. No witness, no physical evidence, just patterns in transport manifests that didn't add up. And now they're very interested in what's on that chip. I didn't give them details, just enough to open the door. But Nolan, here's the part you're not going to like. He paused, and Nolan could hear him choosing his words, which was unusual for a man whose default setting was to say whatever he was thinking at roughly the speed of thought. They need corroboration. The chip data is strong. Coordinates, logistics codes, audio. But it's forensically compromised. It came from a stolen animal, decoded by a private citizen, with no chain of custody. A defense lawyer would have it thrown out before lunch. So what do they need? A person. Someone who was inside Ridgeline. Someone who can testify to what the canine operations looked like from the inside. Someone who reported a discrepancy and was specifically, provably, silenced for it. They need Tyler. Nolan looked across the yard to where Tyler was kneeling beside Echo, rubbing the dog's ears with a tenderness that didn't match his size, or the situation, or anything else about the last week. Tyler looked up and caught Nolan's gaze. Something in the kid's face changed. He could read the call in Nolan's expression the way soldiers read weather. You're talking about putting a 24-year-old, dishonorably discharged former contractor on a witness stand against an $80 million defense company run by a retired colonel with political connections in 3 branches of government. I'm talking about the only path that ends with Foss in handcuffs instead of the Cayman Islands. Tyler's testimony, combined with Webb's data, gives AFOSI enough to open a full investigation. Subpoena Ridgeline's transport manifests, audit the warehouses, trace the component serial numbers back to NATO surplus inventories, match the audio to Foss's voice pattern in official recordings. It's enough, but only if Tyler cooperates. Voluntarily, on the record. I'll talk to him. One more thing. Hatch's voice dropped lower, the cheerfulness gone entirely now. Webb. I found a trail, thin but real. A credit card transaction in Albuquerque, New Mexico, 4 months ago. then a motel in Las Cruces 2 months ago. Then nothing. He's alive, Nolan. Or he was 2 months ago. But he's hiding. Off-grid, cash only, no phone, no digital footprint. And he's hiding from the same people who are currently in your county looking for a German shepherd. Nolan hung up. He stood in the kennel aisle for a full minute, processing. The operation had expanded from a local problem to a federal case in the time it took Hatch to say 4 syllables. Adrian Foss. K9 transport smuggling. NATO weapon components. AFOSI investigation. A missing whistleblower alive in New Mexico. And a 24-year-old kid who was the only thread connecting all of it. The only thread that could be pulled without the whole thing unraveling in the wrong direction. He walked outside. The morning was bright, the sky scrubbed clean by last night's rain. Tyler stood up when he saw Nolan's face. "What is it?" "Sit down." They sat on the kennel steps. The second time Nolan had used these steps for a conversation that mattered, which was 2 more times than he'd anticipated when he built them. Echo lay in the yard nearby, nose resting on his paws, ears tracking a squirrel in the cedar tree by the fence. Normal behavior. Almost peaceful, which felt wrong given what Nolan was about to say. He told Tyler everything. The audio identification, Foss, the scale of the operation, the AFOSI file, Webb alive in New Mexico, maybe, and the ask, Tyler testifying. Tyler listened without interrupting. His face did that thing again, where it went through too many expressions in too short a time. When Nolan finished, the kids sat very still. "They'll kill me." "They'll try. That's different." Is it? Is it actually different? Or is that just something people say to make the next part sound reasonable? It's something I say because I've been in rooms where people were trying to kill me, and I'm still sitting on this step drinking bad coffee. There's a gap between trying and succeeding, and that gap is where people like me live. Tyler looked at him for a long time. People like you. PJs, operators, whatever word makes it make sense to you. The point is, they're contractors. They're good at intimidation, decent at logistics, and probably competent in a straight fight. But they're not in a straight fight. They're in my backyard. And I've been making backyards very uncomfortable for people since before you were born. Echo lifted his head. He looked at Nolan, then at Tyler, then back at Nolan. Then he stood up, walked over, and sat down directly between them, not touching either one, just present. His head turned slowly toward the road, then back. "Even the dog thinks you should calm down," Nolan said. Tyler exhaled. It wasn't agreement, but it wasn't refusal either. It was the sound of a man realizing that the decision had already been made, and the only remaining question was whether he'd make it with his eyes open or closed. "Okay," Tyler said. "I'll do it." They had 3 quiet days. 3 days in which nothing happened, which should have been reassuring, but instead felt like the silence before the part of the song where everything gets loud. Nolan had been in enough firefights to know that the period before contact was always the worst part. Worse than the fight itself, because at least during the fight, your body had something to do besides imagine. Nolan used the time productively because that was his nature, and because sitting still when something was coming felt like a failure of discipline that he couldn't afford. He reached out to AFOSI through Hatch's contact, a woman named Rivera, special agent, out of the Springfield field office. She was careful, professional, and interested without being pushy, which told Nolan she'd been working the Ridgeline file long enough to know that witnesses were fragile ecosystems that collapsed under pressure. She asked questions. Nolan answered what he could and deferred the rest to Tyler's eventual debrief. She said she'd come to Coppervale. Thursday. Bring paperwork. Bring patience. Nolan also used the time to do what he hadn't done since arriving in the Ozarks. He called people. Not many. 3. All former PJs scattered across the country, doing the kinds of jobs that former PJs do. Search and rescue, fire departments, private security. One teaching high school biology in Colorado, which was either the most or least PJ career pivot Nolan had ever heard of. He didn't ask for help. He asked for information. Who ran Ridgeline's security detail? What kind of team would a company like that send after an asset? How many? What equipment? What tactics? The answers were consistent and not encouraging. 3 to 5 operatives, ex-military, well-equipped, comfortable with pressure. They'd avoid local law enforcement involvement because that created paperwork and scrutiny. They'd prefer isolation. They'd prefer night. Meanwhile, Tyler and Echo negotiated their own peace. It happened slowly, the way trust always does when it's been broken by someone else and has to be rebuilt by someone new. In inches, not miles. Never miles. On the second morning, Tyler sat in the training yard and hid a piece of jerky under a bucket. Echo found it in under 4 seconds, his nose tracking the scent with a precision that bordered on mechanical. Tyler hid another under a mat. 6 seconds. Another buried in the grass near the fence. 3 seconds. The dog's detection drive was extraordinary, even by shepherd standards. And when he worked, when he actually engaged with a task that matched his training, his entire bearing changed. The withdrawn, cautious animal became something else entirely. Precise, focused, alive in a way that he wasn't when he was just lying in a yard deciding whether people were trustworthy. There he is, Tyler said, kneeling beside Echo after a particularly fast find. He reached for the dog's ears. Slowly, carefully, the way you reach for something you're afraid will disappear if you touch it. His voice had something in it that Nolan hadn't heard before. Not happiness exactly. Closer to recognition. The sound of a man seeing something he thought he'd lost, and not quite believing it's still there. Echo let Tyler touch his ears. Briefly. 3 seconds, maybe 4. Then he stepped back. But the buffer zone was shorter now, 3 feet instead of 4. And the step back was unhurried, not a retreat, but a renegotiation. On the third morning, something else happened. Nolan was in the equipment shed, checking the trail camera footage from the previous night. Nothing, just raccoons and a possum with poor boundaries. When Echo did something unexpected. The dog walked into the shed, uninvited, unprompted. No command given, no handler present. He walked in, surveyed the space with those dark, calculating eyes, and then lay down in the doorway. Not facing Nolan, facing outward, toward the yard, the gate, the road beyond. guarding the door, guarding Nolan. Nolan looked at him for a long moment. The shed smelled like chain oil and cedar shavings, and the morning light was filtering through the gaps in the boards in thin gold lines that striped the floor and the dog's dark coat. "That's new," he said. Echo's tail moved once, a single slow sweep across the concrete floor. Not enthusiasm, acknowledgement. "I'm here. I've decided. Don't make a big deal about it." "All right," Nolan said. "All right." He went back to the camera footage, and Echo stayed in the doorway, and for about 20 minutes, the world was just a man and a dog, and the sound of mourning happening around them. And it was the closest thing to peace that Nolan had felt since this started. Thursday came. The quiet ended. Nolan woke at 2 a.m, not to a sound, to the absence of one. The kennel dogs, who normally stirred and settled and stirred again throughout the night in a rhythm that Nolan had learned to sleep through, were completely silent. 7 dogs, not one sound. Not a whine, not a shift of weight on a crate mat, not a collar tag clicking against a bowl. That kind of silence doesn't happen by accident. That kind of silence means every animal in the building is listening to the same thing. And whatever they're listening to is important enough to override every instinct that normally keeps a kennel noisy. He rolled off the cot and reached for the flashlight in the same motion. His feet found the floor. His hand found the shotgun that he kept beside the desk. Legal, loaded with number 4 buckshot, and maintained with the obsessive regularity that 20 years of military service instills in a person's relationship with things that keep them alive. Then Echo barked. Once. Sharp. A single hard crack of sound that split the silence and stopped as abruptly as it started. Not a warning bark. Not an alarm bark. A declaration. "I see you." Nolan moved through the kennel aisle in the dark. He didn't turn on the flashlight because darkness was an equalizer, and his eyes had been adjusting since he'd woken up. And anyone coming in from outside with headlights in their recent memory would be temporarily blind. Advantage. Inside. He moved with the specific quiet that PJs learned during the pipeline. When you're taught that noise is information, and information gets people killed. He reached Echo's run. The dog was standing, body rigid, tail low and still, facing the wall that backed onto the equipment yard. Not the front gate, not the roadside, the equipment side. Someone had come in from a direction that wasn't covered by the motion lights, which meant someone had scouted during daylight and knew which approach was dark. "Show me," Nolan whispered. He moved to the side door, eased it open. The night air was warm and thick, carrying the smell of honeysuckle and damp earth, and something else. Diesel. Faint. From an engine that had been running recently and wasn't running now. Recent meant minutes, not hours. They were close, or they were already gone. The equipment yard was dark. The motion light on the east corner was off, and it wasn't burned out. Nolan could see from where he stood that the bulb had been unscrewed one full turn, just enough to break the circuit, just enough to prove that whoever did it had stood on something and reached up and taken the time to do it quietly, which was a level of preparation that said professional. Nothing moved. But something had. The air felt disturbed in a way Nolan couldn't explain,
and didn't need to. 20 years of entering spaces where something had recently changed had given him an instinct for residual presence, the invisible fingerprint that a person leaves on a room just by passing through it. Someone had been here. Recently. He circled the building, flashlight on now, beam low, scanning for tracks. The south fence tripwire was intact. The cameras were running. He'd check the footage later. The front gate was locked, but when he reached the dog runs on the back side of the building, he stopped. Echo's exterior access panel, the hinged section that allowed hosing and cleaning without entering the run, had been opened from outside. The padlock was on the ground, cut clean through with a bolt cutter. The shackle separated so cleanly that it looked manufactured that way. The panel was closed again, pushed shut, but not locked. And Echo was still inside, untouched, untaken. That was the message. Not an attempt, a demonstration. We were here. We were 10 feet from your dog. We could have taken him. We chose not to. Think about what that means. Nolan picked up the severed padlock, held it in his hand. The metal was still warm from the friction of the cut. He looked at the clean edge and felt something that was related to anger, but older than anger. It was the feeling he'd had in Helmand when an IED went off 50 meters ahead of his convoy, and he knew with absolute certainty that whoever had placed it was watching from a ridge, timing their work, proud of it. Tyler appeared behind him, barefoot, breathing hard. What happened? Someone was here. They cut the lock on Echo's run. Nolan straightened up. His voice was level. His eyes were scanning the tree line, the fence, the road, every shadow that could hold a person. They didn't take him. They wanted us to know they could. Tyler looked at the cut padlock, then at Echo through the wire panel. The dog was sitting in his run, head up, ears forward, body still. Not panicked, not cowering, just watching. The posture of an animal who had been in situations like this before and had learned that watching was more useful than barking. We have to move. We have to go. We can't stay here if they can just walk in and... They want us to move. That's the point. Moving means we're reacting, which means they're controlling our decisions. They are in control. They were 10 feet from Echo in the middle of the night, and we didn't hear a thing until Echo barked. One bark. Controlled. Not panic. Alert. Which means the dog did his job, and the intruder knew the dog was going to do his job, which is why he didn't try to actually take Echo. Nolan set the padlock on the ground. They bypassed the motion light. That means daylight recon. They came in from the east because the cameras cover the north and the gate. They used bolt cutters, which means they brought tools, which means this was planned. He paused, breathed. Professional. But not perfect. Leaving the lock as a message is a psychological operation. PSYOPs means they're still in the intimidation phase. If they wanted the dog, they'd have taken the dog. Tyler stared at him. How are you this calm? Practice. Nolan sat down against the kennel wall. The concrete was cool through his shirt. His knee throbbed with the particular insistence of cartilage that had been asked to do too many things too quickly after too many years. His ears rang. The tinnitus was always worse when his heart rate spiked, and his heart rate had definitely spiked. Echo appeared at the run panel, the one that had been cut open and closed again. He pushed his nose through the wire mesh toward Nolan. not whining, just present. His shoulder pressed against the mesh, light, steady. Nolan reached through and touched the dog's muzzle, just fingertips. Yeah, I know, buddy. We're okay. They weren't. But saying so was a form of maintenance. You spoke the thing you needed and trusted that the words would carry weight even when the facts didn't support them. Tyler hadn't moved. He was standing in the dark with his bare feet on the gravel and his arms crossed and his jaw set in a way that no one recognized because he'd seen it on every young operator who'd just been told the situation was bad and had decided, in that particular way that 24-year-olds decide things, that bad was no longer acceptable. If I run, they win, Tyler said. Nolan looked at him. It was the first thing Tyler had said since arriving that didn't sound like a kid. It sounded like a man. Yeah, they do. Tyler nodded. Then, what do you need me to do? Right now? Go inside, check the cameras, write down every timestamp that shows movement. Don't touch anything outside. And in the morning, we call Rivera at AFOSI and move up the timeline. Tyler went inside. Nolan stayed against the wall for another minute, listening to the night. The tree frogs had gone quiet too, which meant whatever had disturbed the kennel had disturbed everything. The Ozarks were holding their breath. 14 minutes, Nolan said to the dark. Then, softer, barely audible. Not this time. Nolan slept in the equipment shed that night, with the shotgun across his knees and one ear on the property. Tyler slept in the office, or didn't sleep more likely, based on the light that was still on at 3 a.m. Echo stayed in the repaired run. Nolan had replaced the padlock with a combination lock and added a second securing clip. It wouldn't stop bolt cutters, but it would take longer, and longer was the difference between a response and a reaction. Morning came, gray and heavy. Rain again. Nolan made coffee in the office while Tyler sat at the desk looking like he'd aged 5 years overnight. Echo lay in the office doorway, guard position again, facing the yard, with his chin on his paws and his eyes open. We should call Rivera, Tyler said. Move up the meeting. Tell her what happened. Already did. Left a message at 4 a.m. She'll call back. Tyler nodded. Then he stood up, put on his jacket, and walked toward the door. Where are you going? To check the perimeter, like you showed me. Nolan almost stopped him. The instinct was immediate and muscular. Stay inside. Stay where I can see you. Stay where I can control the situation. But he watched Tyler walk out with his shoulders squared and his head up and his eyes doing that scan again, left to right, tree line to road. And Nolan recognized something that he didn't like recognizing. Tyler wasn't running. Tyler was adapting. And adapting was what happened when a scared person decided to stop being scared and start being angry. Nolan let him go. It took effort. Rivera didn't call back. Thursday came and went with the slow, heavy inevitability of a day that knows it's carrying bad news and isn't in any hurry to deliver it. Nolan called Hatch. Hatch said Rivera had gone dark. Not unusual for AFOSI. They work on their own timeline, which is approximately glacial. But he'd keep trying. The data was ready to send. The audio was complete. Everything was assembled and waiting for someone with a badge and a subpoena to receive it.
Tyler got quieter as the day went on. Not the good kind of quiet, the planning kind. Nolan recognized it because he'd spent decades around people who made plans, and the silence of a person planning something responsible sounded very different from the silence of a person planning something brave and catastrophically wrong. Tyler's silence was the second kind. Nolan tried to head it off. "Whatever you're thinking, stop thinking it." Tyler looked at him from across the kennel office. "I'm not thinking anything." "You're thinking about going to them, walking in, explaining, making it stop by making yourself the solution." Tyler's jaw tightened. He didn't deny it. Echo, who was lying in the doorway between them, lifted his head and looked at Tyler, then at Nolan, then lay his chin back down. The dog's ears stayed up. "Tyler, listen to me. The people looking for Echo don't accept explanations. They accept silence. Permanent silence. You walking in doesn't make this stop. It makes you a loose end that's already halfway tied." "You don't know that." "I know that because this is what I did for 20 years. I went into places where people had been taken by people who didn't plan to give them back. And the reason I was sent is because talking had already failed." Nolan's voice was steady, but the words were hitting harder than he intended. He could hear himself sounding like every instructor he'd ever had, the ones who'd confused urgency with volume and caring with control. "This is not your mess to clean up alone. It's not yours either." That landed. Tyler was right, and they both knew it. And knowing it didn't change the fact that Nolan was going to protect this kid, whether the kid wanted protecting or not. Because that was the pathology, wasn't it? That was what reluctant mentor really meant when you stripped away the clean language. It meant, "I failed once. I will not fail again. And I will burn everything else down to make sure of it, including your right to make your own decisions." Echo shook himself off. The full body shake, ears to tail, that dogs do when the tension in a room gets too heavy. Stress release. Reset. The dog looked at Nolan as if to say, "Both of you, enough." "All right," Nolan said. "We wait for Rivera. One more day. That's the play." Tyler nodded, but the nod was too quick and his eyes didn't match it. He found the note at 6 the next morning. Nolan had slept in the equipment shed again, shotgun across his knees, one ear on the property. He'd slept hard. Harder than he should have. Harder than the situation warranted. His body had made a decision about rest that his mind hadn't authorized. And by the time he woke to gray light and birdsong and the particular stillness that settles over the Ozarks at dawn, the damage was done. The office was empty. Tyler's cot was cold. His duffel bag was gone. His car was gone. The note was on the desk, written on the back of a dog food receipt, in handwriting that was careful in the way that handwriting gets when someone is choosing their words because they know these are the last words they'll write to a particular person. "I'm not letting you get killed for me. I'm going back to talk to them. I know where Decker is staying, the motor lodge on Route 14. I can explain that I don't have the data, that I don't know what's on the chip, that it was Webb, not me. They'll believe me because it's the truth. This is my mess, and I should be the one cleaning it up. Take care of Echo. He's better off with you than he ever was with me. I think we both know that." I'm sorry.
Nolan read it twice.
3 times. The words didn't change. They were the words of someone who believed that sacrifice was the same thing as solution, that offering yourself up to the machine would make the machine stop. And Nolan knew, with the certainty of a man who had spent 20 years learning the difference between courage and foolishness, and who had buried people who couldn't tell them apart, that Tyler Pratt was walking into something he couldn't walk out of. Decker didn't want an explanation. Decker wanted the dog, the data, and the silence. Tyler could provide the silence, but only one way. Echo was standing at the office door, the door that Tyler had walked through probably hours ago, in the dark, while Nolan slept 30 yards away with a shotgun he didn't need, because the threat wasn't coming from outside. The threat had walked out on its own. The dog's nose was working the threshold, sniffing the ground, the door frame, the air where Tyler had passed. Tracing the scent path down the steps, across the gravel, to the spot where the Honda had been parked, and now wasn't. A low whine built in Echo's chest. Not fear, not alarm. Confusion. The scent was there, but the person wasn't. And for a dog, that equation had been solved before, and the answer had never been good. Echo looked at Nolan. The dog's eyes were steady, but his body was tense. Every muscle locked in a posture that said, something is wrong, and you need to fix it, because that is what you do, and I am asking you to do it now. Kyle Beckert's voice in Nolan's head, distant and clear, and 20 years old and as present as if he were standing in the room. You can't save everyone, Sergeant. The hell I can't. Nolan grabbed his keys, his phone, the shotgun. He paused at the door and looked at Echo. The dog was already on his feet, body forward, ears locked, waiting. Come. English. Not German, not a command Echo had been trained to obey. A request from a person the dog had spent a week deciding whether to trust. Echo came, without hesitation, without looking back. The phone rang as Nolan was pulling out of the kennel gate, gravel spraying under the tires, the morning still gray and heavy around them. He answered on the second ring. Voss. Decker's voice, relaxed, the particular relaxation of a man holding every card and wanting you to know it. Morning, Sergeant. Your boy walked into my hotel room about 2 hours ago. Very brave. Very, very stupid. Nolan's hands tightened on the steering wheel. His knuckles went white against the rubber. His breathing didn't change. His voice didn't change. That was the training. The body can panic all at once, but the voice stays level, because the voice is what the enemy hears, and what the enemy hears is all that matters. Put him on. He's not in a talking mood right now. Took a little convincing to stay put, but he's staying. A pause. Theatrical. A deliberate pause, the sort a man inserts to let you imagine what convincing looked like. Here's how this works. You bring the dog to the Elroy Mine turnoff, north of town. You know where that is. Noon, today. The dog, and whatever data you've pulled from that chip. All of it. In exchange, you get the kid back in mostly the same condition you last saw him. And if I don't, then this conversation is the last one you have about Tyler Pratt, and the next person who asks about him is going to be using past tense. Noon, Sergeant. Don't be late. The line went dead. Nolan held the phone against his ear for another second, listening to the silence, which sounded exactly like the silence after Kyle Beckert stopped breathing. Same silence. Different decade. Same weight. He set the phone down. Echo sat in the passenger seat, rigid, ears forward, watching the road ahead with an intensity that said the dog understood. Not the words, but the current, the electricity, the shift in the air that meant everything had changed. Nolan exhaled, checked the clock, checked the shotgun behind the seat, checked the phone. Then he called Hatch. I need you to do two things. First, send the chip data and the audio file to Rivera at AFOSI. Everything, right now. Don't wait for her to call back. Send it, and send it again. Second, if I don't call you by 1400 hours today, send everything to every federal law enforcement contact you have and every journalist you've ever bought a drink for. Silence. Then quietly, Nolan, what is happening? Tyler's been taken. I'm going to get him back. Alone? Nolan glanced at Echo. The dog's dark eyes met his. Steady, unblinking, present in a way that nothing else in Nolan's life had been present for a very long time. Not alone. I've got the dog. Nolan didn't drive to the Elroy mine. Not directly. Driving directly to a location where an armed man was expecting you was called obliging the enemy's plan, and Nolan had spent 20 years specifically not doing that. He drove to the overlook on County Road 9, a gravel pull-off 3 miles east of the mine entrance that he'd used twice before. Once for a hike he'd never repeated because the trail turned out to involve a creek crossing that his knee had opinions about. And once when he'd needed to sit in a truck and not talk to anyone for a while, which was a surprisingly common need in his life. He parked, killed the engine, opened the glove box and pulled out a topo map that was 5 years old and creased along every fold line. The Elroy mine had been closed for 3 decades, which meant the map was probably more accurate than any satellite image, because abandoned places don't change. They just decay. And they decay predictably. All right. He spread the map across the steering wheel. Echo sat in the passenger seat, head turned toward Nolan, watching with an attention that had shifted since they'd left the kennel. The dog was no longer passive. Something had engaged behind those dark eyes. Something trained. Something dormant that the urgency had woken up. Here's the situation. Main shaft entrance off the county road north side. That's where Decker told me to show up. Noon. With you and the data. Which means that's where he wants me. Visible. Controlled. On his terms. Entering from the front means I'm walking into a funnel. One way in, no concealment. They see me coming from 200 yards. Echo's ears rotated slightly, tracking Nolan's voice with that focused precision that said the dog was listening to tone, not words. We're not doing that. The map showed 3 other access points. A secondary shaft entrance on the east slope, partially collapsed according to county records from 1998, but only partially, which in mine terms meant the timbers had shifted and the clearance was reduced, not eliminated. A ventilation shaft near the ridgeline marked as sealed, which meant someone had welded a grate over it 20 years ago, and 20 Ozark winters had been working on that grate ever since. And an old equipment road that switchbacked up the south face, too narrow for vehicles, but walkable if you didn't mind exposed terrain and a 400-foot drop on one side. Nolan studied the contour lines. North and west faces, steep, exposed, no tree cover. Anyone approaching from there would be visible for a quarter mile. The east approach was gentler, heavy timber, and the ventilation shaft sat at roughly 1,400 feet elevation, about 200 vertical feet above the main chamber level. That meant descending through the shaft would put him inside the mine from above, behind and above anyone positioned in the main chamber. High ground, interior access, element of surprise. This was what PJ training was actually about. Not the indoc, not the free fall or the dive qualifications or the paramedic certification, though all of those mattered. The core of it, the part that separated PJs from everyone else, was the ability to look at a situation where everything was wrong and locate the one element that could be made right, and then move toward it with absolute commitment while your body was exhausted and your mind was cataloging all the ways this could end badly. The ventilation shaft was the one right element. East approach, vent shaft entry. We go in from above. They expect front door. We come through the ceiling. Echo tilted his head. The head tilt was almost comical given the circumstances. A dog cocking his head in the middle of a rescue planning session. But Nolan had stopped being surprised by Echo's timing. The dog had been reading rooms better than most humans since the day he'd arrived, and this was just the first time the room happened to be a truck cab in a gravel pull-off overlooking a closed mine where a young man was being held by armed contractors. Yeah, I know it's not a great plan. Great plans require more than one person and a dog. We work with what we have. He checked the shotgun. Loaded. 5 rounds of number 4 buckshot. Safety on. He added a flashlight with fresh batteries, 50 feet of paracord from behind the seat, and the first aid kit from the center console. PJs keep first aid kits everywhere. In trucks, in closets, in gym bags, behind couch cushions. You pack medical first, always, because the baseline assumption is that someone is going to need it, and sometimes the someone is you. He also packed water, 2 bottles, one for him, one for the dog, because dehydration impairs judgment, and judgment was the only advantage he had over 3 armed men in a mine. The drive to the east approach took 20 minutes on roads that weren't really roads anymore. Logging trails that had been reclaimed by grass and runoff. He parked the truck behind a collapsed barn a mile out, where the canopy was thick enough to hide the vehicle from anything short of aerial surveillance, and they walked the rest. The Ozarks in late spring smelled like everything growing at once. Dogwood, sassafras, the thick green exhale of oak forest after 2 weeks of rain. Under the canopy, the light came through in broken columns, dappled and shifting, and the ground was soft with leaf litter that made silence difficult, but not impossible. Nolan moved through the timber with the specific discipline that 20 years of PJ operations had engraved into his nervous system. Weight on the balls of his feet, steps placed on root and rock rather than leaf. Breathing controlled, in through the nose, out through the mouth, slow enough that the rhythm didn't create a pattern that someone listening could identify as human. It wasn't silent. True silence was impossible in a forest where birds were calling and squirrels were running commentary on every mammal within 50 yards. But it was intentional, which was close enough. Echo moved beside him, not ahead, not behind, beside. The dog had fallen into a working pace without instruction or command. Low body, ears up and rotating, nose active, but not locked on any particular scent. Just moving. Two organisms covering ground together with a synchronized efficiency that should have required weeks of training, and instead had appeared fully formed, as if the partnership had been waiting somewhere inside both of them for a reason to exist. Nolan noticed this, filed it, didn't examine it too closely, because examining things too closely while walking toward an armed confrontation was a luxury that got people killed. They reached the ventilation shaft at 11:15, 45 minutes before Decker's deadline. The shaft was exactly what the map suggested. A concrete-lined opening in the hillside, roughly 3 feet in diameter, covered by a steel grate that had rusted through at 2 of its 4 anchor points. 20 years of Ozark weather had done most of the work. Nolan pulled the grate aside with one hand. It shifted with less resistance than he'd expected, which was good. Noise was the one variable he couldn't control once they went underground. He shined the flashlight into the shaft. The beam cut through darkness that smelled like limestone and standing water, and the particular mineral coldness of air that hadn't moved in years. The shaft angled downward at roughly 30 degrees, steep but manageable. Concrete walls, damp, mineral deposited, with the occasional root system pushing through a crack. Not a pleasant environment, but Nolan had crawled through worse. Considerably worse, in places where the things at the other end of the crawl were shooting at him. "I need you to go first," he said to Echo. "The shaft narrows about 50 feet in. I'm too wide in the shoulders to lead if it gets tight. You take point." Echo looked at the shaft opening, then at Nolan, then at the shaft again. He sniffed the air coming from the opening, once, twice, a third time with more intensity, his nostrils flaring as he processed whatever chemical information the mine's ventilation system was broadcasting. Then, without command or hesitation or any visible reluctance, he stepped into the opening and began moving downward. His claws scraped lightly on the concrete. His body blocked most of the flashlight beam, turning the shaft into a tunnel of shadow with a German shepherd silhouette at the end of it. Nolan followed. The concrete was cold under his hands. His knee protested immediately and was ignored immediately. Some parts of the body get a vote. Some don't. The shaft narrowed at the 50-foot mark, enough that Nolan had to turn sideways and push through with his shoulders compressed. Echo had gone ahead, his dark shape barely visible in the flashlight beam, moving with a certainty that suggested the dog was navigating by scent rather than sight. Smart. In a tunnel, scent was more reliable than light. Air moved predictably underground, downhill toward larger volumes, and whatever was in the main chamber would be broadcasting its presence through the ventilation system like a speaker through a duct. The shaft leveled out, then opened. Nolan emerged into a space roughly the size of a 2-car garage, an auxiliary chamber, probably a pump room in the mine's working days. Empty now, except for debris and the remnants of old piping. A corridor extended from the far wall, heading deeper into the mine toward the main shaft area. Dim light flickered at the end of it. Electric. Probably a portable work lamp. Decker had set up shop. Echo was already at the corridor entrance, body low, ears locked forward. Not a sound. The dog had gone operational in a way that told Nolan his MWD training hadn't been forgotten. It had been dormant, waiting for a reason to resurface. Nolan crouched beside him, listened. Voices. 2, maybe 3. The acoustic properties of the mine made it difficult to separate. Sound bounced off stone walls and folded back on itself. But one of the voices was Tyler's. Alive. Strained, but alive. Easy. Stay close. They moved down the corridor. Nolan kept the flashlight off. The light from the main chamber was enough to navigate by, and arriving in the dark was better than announcing himself with a beam. His boots found solid ground with each step. The shotgun was at low ready, barrel angled down, stock tucked against his shoulder. The paracord was looped over his left arm. The first aid kit was in his jacket pocket. Medical first, always. The corridor opened into the main chamber. Larger than the pump room, maybe 40 feet across, ceiling supported by timber beams that had survived 30 years of neglect through what Nolan assumed was stubbornness. 2 portable work lights threw harsh white circles onto the stone floor. Extension cord trailing to a generator somewhere deeper in the mine, its hum low and constant. Tyler sat in the center of the lit area, wrists zip-tied to a metal chair that had been bolted to the floor. His face was bruised, left cheekbone swollen, lip split, one eye starting to close. He was conscious. He was breathing. He was alive. Nolan's medical training registered this in under 2 seconds and moved on. Decker stood 3 feet from Tyler, arms crossed, relaxed in that performed way that men use when they want to project control. 2 other men flanked the chamber, one near the main shaft entrance, one near a secondary tunnel. Both armed, both alert, but not actively scanning. They were expecting Nolan to come through the front door at noon with a dog on a leash and a chip in his pocket. Not through the ventilation system at 11:45 with a shotgun. Nolan assessed. 3 targets, 2 armed, 1, Decker, probably armed but hands not visible. Tyler restrained, but mobile if freed. Echo beside him, tense, silent, watching Nolan for direction. The math wasn't good. 3 against 1 with a hostage in the middle was the kind of equation that Surrey School called unresolvable through direct action, and that PJ School called Tuesday. He moved to the left, staying in the shadow of the corridor entrance. The nearest contractor was 10 feet away, facing the main shaft, sidearm holstered. The second was 20 feet away, opposite side, same posture. Decker was center, back partially turned. Nolan exhaled. 1 breath, controlled. Then he moved. The first contractor didn't hear him until it was too late. Nolan closed the distance in 3 steps, grabbed the man's collar and weapon hand simultaneously, and drove him into the stone wall. The impact was hard enough to stun, not hard enough to crack bone. The man's sidearm clattered to the ground. Nolan kicked it into the dark. Echo moved at the same instant. The dog launched from the corridor entrance toward the second contractor with a speed and precision that was not a pet reacting to chaos. It was a military working dog executing a trained response. 80 pounds of German Shepherd hit the man's chest and drove him backward. The contractor went down, arms flailing, and Echo was on him, not biting, pinning. Front paws on the man's chest, mouth open, teeth visible, a sound coming from his throat that was beyond a growl. It was a promise. Decker turned. His hand went to his belt. Nolan was already there. Don't. Decker's hand stopped. His eyes found Nolan's across the chamber. The work lights threw long shadows across both their faces. For a moment, nobody moved. "You're early," Decker said. His voice was steady, but his eyes were doing the math. One man down, one man under a dog, and a PJ with a shotgun standing close enough that missing would require deliberate effort. "And you're done." "Am I?" Decker's chin lifted slightly. Not defiance, calculation. "You came in with a shotgun and a dog against 3 armed men. That's either courage or stupidity, and I've seen enough of both to know the difference usually doesn't matter. Here's what matters." Nolan kept the shotgun steady. His voice was the voice he'd used on every mission where the outcome balanced on what was said next. Calm, measured, and absolutely devoid of bluff. The data from Echo's chip was transmitted to AFOSI 40 minutes ago. All of it. Coordinates, logistics codes, and a 40-second audio recording of Adrian Foss giving direct instructions to route weapon components through K9 transport manifests. Your boss's voice, on a recording, ordering the movement of stolen NATO surplus hardware. That recording is now in the possession of a federal law enforcement agency that has been building a case against Ridgeline Solutions for 18 months. Decker's face changed. Not much. He was too disciplined for that, but enough. The calculation behind his eyes shifted from tactical to legal. From, "Can I win this fight?" to, "How much of this is already over?" "That's a bluff. Call Foss. Ask him." Nolan tilted his head slightly. "Or don't. Either way, in about 6 hours, AFOSI is going to have subpoenas for every transport manifest Ridgeline has filed since 2022. They're going to audit every warehouse on that coordinate list, and they're going to match the audio to Foss's voice pattern from his congressional testimony last March, which is public record. The question isn't whether Foss goes down. The question is whether you go down with him. The chamber was silent except for the generator's hum and the sound of Echo's breathing, which was steady and controlled, and somehow louder than everything else. The contractor under Echo hadn't moved. The one against the wall was sitting on the ground, holding his shoulder, done fighting. The math had changed, and everyone in the room knew it. Decker lowered his hand from his belt. Slowly. Both hands visible now. "I was following orders." "Yeah." Nolan's voice went quiet. Not soft. Quiet. The distinction mattered. That line stopped working about 80 years ago. Decker held Nolan's gaze for 3 more seconds. Then he stepped back. Away from Tyler. Away from the chair. His hands stayed visible. Nolan moved to Tyler immediately. The zip ties were industrial, thick, tight, cutting into the skin. Nolan pulled a knife from his pocket and cut them with 2 precise motions. Tyler's wrists were raw and swollen. Nolan checked them. Circulation intact, no fracture. Pain, but functional. "Can you walk?" Tyler looked at him. His good eye was wet. His bad eye was swelling shut. His lip was bleeding. But he was looking at Nolan with an expression that Nolan recognized because he'd seen it once before. In a field hospital in Helmand. In a mirror he'd rather not have looked into. "You came." "Of course I came." Echo left the contractor on the ground and moved to Tyler. The dog pushed his nose against Tyler's hand, the one that was swollen and abraded, and held it there. Not sniffing, just touching. Warm nose against damaged skin. Tyler's fingers closed around the dog's muzzle, gently, and held on. The sheriff arrived 22 minutes later. Nolan had called him from the mine entrance after walking Tyler and Echo out into daylight that felt too bright and too normal for what had just happened underground. Sheriff Colton Branch, a name that sounded like it belonged in a western, and a man who looked like he'd rather be managing a property dispute than a federal crime scene, brought 2 deputies, an ambulance that Tyler refused to get into, and a lot of questions that Nolan answered selectively. The selective answering was not obstruction. It was triage. The sheriff needed to know that 3 men had kidnapped a person, held him in an abandoned mine, and assaulted him. The sheriff did not need to know about encrypted microchips, NATO surplus weapon components, or an AFOSI investigation that was about to land on his county like a weather system. That information belonged to Rivera, and giving it to the wrong person first could compromise the chain that led to Foss. Decker and his 2 contractors were taken into custody. The charges for now were trespassing, assault, and unlawful restraint, which was enough to hold them while the federal machinery assembled itself. Decker went quietly. His 2 men went more quietly. The fight had left all of them somewhere between the moment Nolan's shotgun appeared and the moment he'd explained. With the conversational directness of a man who had been shot at by people considerably more motivated than they were, that their employer was already finished. Tyler sat in the back of Nolan's truck while the EMT checked his injuries. Bruised ribs, 2, possibly 3. No sign of fracture. Split lip, no stitches needed. Left eye swollen, but the orbital wasn't compromised. Abrasions on both wrists from the zip ties, cleaned and bandaged. He looked, in Nolan's medical assessment, like a man who had been beaten by people who wanted to scare him rather than destroy him, which was a distinction that only mattered if you were the one doing the assessment. Echo sat beside the truck, positioned between Tyler and the sheriff's vehicles, facing outward, still guarding, still operational. The dog hadn't fully stood down since the mine, and Nolan suspected he wouldn't for a while. Some switches, once flipped, take time to turn off. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of phone calls, written statements, and the particular exhaustion that comes after adrenaline exits the body and leaves behind nothing but the residue of everything you chose not to feel while the adrenaline was doing its job. Nolan slept 12 hours the first night. He didn't remember deciding to sleep. His body simply stopped accepting input and shut down. And when he woke up, Echo was lying on the floor beside his cot, with his chin on his paws and his eyes open, watching. Which meant the dog had been awake the entire time Nolan hadn't been. Tyler gave his formal statement to Rivera at the Coppervale Sheriff's Office. 3 hours, detailed, recorded, witnessed by a deputy and a second AFOSI agent who'd driven down from Kansas City. Tyler told them everything. The weight discrepancies, the discharge, the 43 hours between his report and his removal. He told them about Webb, about Echo, about the microchip. He told them about Decker. He told them about the mine.
Rivera listened with the focused patience of someone who'd been waiting 18 months for exactly this conversation and was not about to rush it now that it was finally happening. Foss was arrested at his home in McLean, Virginia on a Friday morning, 6 days after the mine. The news reached Nolan through Hatch, who'd heard it from a contact at AFOSI, who'd heard it from someone on the arrest team. Apparently, he was eating breakfast, Hatch reported, sounding like a man who had found something to be cheerful about for the first time in 2 weeks. Eggs Benedict. Didn't even put his fork down when they came through the door. That's either composure or clinical narcissism, and I'm not qualified to diagnose either one. The charges were significant. Conspiracy to traffic stolen military equipment, fraud against the United States government, misuse of defense contracts, wire fraud, and, because Foss had used his retired officer status to facilitate meetings with active-duty procurement officials, a charge that carried the particular weight of betrayal. Conversion of government property by a person of trust. A charge that made JAG lawyers sit up straighter. Webb was located in Las Cruces, New Mexico, 2 days after Foss's arrest. He'd been living under the name David Marsh in a rented room above a hardware store, paying cash, working part-time as a dog trainer at a local shelter. When Rivera's team found him, Webb confirmed everything. The supply chain, the canine transport cover, the data he'd embedded in Echo's chip. He'd done it, he said, because he knew they would come for him eventually, and he wanted the evidence to survive, even if he didn't. When Rivera told him that Echo was safe, alive, healthy, with a retired PJ in Missouri, Webb reportedly said nothing for a full 30 seconds. Then he asked to see a picture of the dog. The formal review of Tyler Pratt's discharge was initiated the following week. It would take months. Military bureaucracy moves at the speed of military bureaucracy, which is roughly the speed of continental drift, regardless of how urgent the underlying facts might be. But the process had started. Tyler's name, the thing that Ridgeline had taken from him with a 43-hour precision strike disguised as due process, was being returned. Slowly, through channels, with paperwork. It was enough. Or it was the beginning of enough, which amounted to the same thing, if you were willing to wait. The morning that Tyler left, the Ozarks looked like a postcard that someone had designed specifically to make the previous 2 weeks feel like a dream. Sunlight through the cedar trees, mist rising off the creek in thin white ribbons. The kind of spring morning that smelled like new growth and warm soil, and the particular freshness that exists only in places where humans haven't paved over every surface. Nolan stood on the kennel steps with a mug of coffee that had been hot 15 minutes ago and was now lukewarm, heading toward cold. He wasn't drinking it. He wasn't sure he'd poured it with the intention of drinking it. Sometimes holding a mug was just something to do with your hands, when your hands wanted to hold something, and there was nothing left to hold on to. The AFOSI vehicle came up the gravel road at 8 sharp. Black sedan. Government plates. A car that looked exactly like what it was, because federal agencies had never been particularly good at subtlety, and had apparently decided at some institutional level to stop trying. Tyler was packed. The Honda Civic was staying behind, impounded as potential evidence, though Nolan suspected it would end up in a county auction lot within 6 months, which was a better fate than the car probably deserved. Rivera's team had arranged transport. Tyler would give additional depositions in Springfield, then possibly D.C. Witness coordination, case preparation, legal briefings, work that would take months and would require Tyler to be somewhere structured and secure, which was another way of saying, not here. Tyler came out of the kennel office with his duffel bag over his shoulder and a dog food receipt in his back pocket that Nolan suspected was the note he'd written and that Tyler had kept. He looked different than the kid who'd arrived 10 days ago. Not older exactly, not in the way that people mean when they say aged, and what they actually mean is damaged. Different in a way that was harder to name. Straighter, more certain. Like someone who'd made a decision that cost him something, and had paid it, and was still standing. And the standing was the point. He had a bruise on his cheek that was yellowing at the edges. His lip was healing. His hands were steady. He stopped at the bottom of the steps. Nolan was at the top. Between them, 3 steps of treated lumber, and 10 days of something that neither of them had a clean word for. Not friendship exactly. Not mentorship exactly. Something that occupied the space between those things and had no name, because naming it would make it smaller than it was. I don't know how to say this, Tyler said. Then don't. Words are overrated, especially the kind people feel obligated to say at doorsteps. Tyler almost smiled. Almost. The bruise on his cheek moved when his face did, which was a reminder that 10 days ago this kid had walked into a hotel room where armed men were waiting because he thought his own life was a reasonable price for someone else's safety. That was either stupid or brave, and Nolan had decided during the long hours between then and now that the distinction mattered less than the fact that Tyler was still here to be either one. Thank you for the 3 days that turned into 10, for not letting me be stupid alone. You weren't stupid, you were brave. Those look the same from the outside, but they're not. I've known brave people who did stupid things, and stupid people who accidentally did brave ones. You're the first kind. Hold on to that. Tyler looked at the ground. When he looked up again, his eyes were clear and wet at the same time, which was a combination that Nolan recognized because he'd seen it in mirrors and in field hospitals, and in the eyes of every young person who'd ever stood at the edge of something they couldn't undo and decided to step forward anyway. What about Echo? The question hung in the air. Nolan had been expecting it since the morning Echo first sat at his feet instead of Tyler's. You know it's coming, but it still hits when it arrives. What about him? He's my dog. Technically. Legally, I guess, if you can call anything about this situation legal. Tyler looked at the kennel, at the runs, at the yard where he'd hidden jerky under buckets and watched a dog remember who he was. But he doesn't follow my commands anymore, Nolan. He follows yours. He follows whoever makes him feel safe. Yeah, Tyler nodded, slowly, like a man setting something down that he'd been carrying for too long and that had finally, mercifully, gotten too heavy to justify. Exactly. Echo was sitting in the kennel doorway. He'd been watching from there for the last 20 minutes, through the packing, the loading, the conversation that he couldn't understand in words, but could almost certainly read in tone and posture, and the particular chemistry of human emotion that dogs detect before humans even know they're broadcasting it. His ears were up. His eyes moved between Tyler and Nolan with the measured attention of an animal who understood, perhaps better than either of them, that something was ending and something else was beginning, and that both things were necessary, and that neither one was easy. Tyler walked to him, knelt down slowly, favoring his bruised ribs, put his hand on the dog's head, behind the ears, in the spot that Echo had always liked, even when he wouldn't let anyone else near it. Echo let him. The dog leaned into the touch, just slightly, just for a moment, the way a door leans against a frame before closing. An acknowledgement. A goodbye. Bleib, Tyler said. Stay, in German, the language Echo trusted, the language that meant the command was real and final and not negotiable. Echo stayed. Tyler stood up. He didn't look back at the dog. Looking back would have made it harder, and he'd already done the hard part. He looked at Nolan. His name means he always comes back. I know what his name means. Tyler nodded once. A single, precise motion that contained everything he couldn't say and knew he didn't need to. He picked up his bag, walked to the AFOS-I vehicle, opened the door, got in. The door closed with the solid thud of government engineering. The engine started. The vehicle pulled away down the gravel road, slow at first, then steady, then gone around the bend where the cedar trees leaned in and the road curved toward the valley and the world beyond it. Dust settled on the gravel. The engine sound faded. Then it was gone entirely, and the only sounds left were the tree frogs and the creek and the wind doing what wind does in the Ozarks, which is move through everything without disturbing anything. Nolan stood on the steps for a while after the vehicle disappeared. The mug was still in his hand. He looked at it, considered pouring it out, and set it on the railing instead. Some things you hold on to past the point of purpose. The kennel was quiet. The 7 client dogs were fed and settled. The sun was coming up over the ridge to the east, turning everything gold and green and impossibly ordinary. Somewhere in the distance, the barred owl, the same one that had been calling every evening since Nolan moved here, let out a final morning call before going to sleep. The world was doing what the world does when crises end. It continued. Nolan sat down on the top step. His knee protested. His back protested. His left ear hummed with the tinnitus that had been his constant companion since Helmand. Steady as a heartbeat. Permanent as a scar. He set the cold coffee beside him on the step. Echo hadn't moved from the doorway. He was still sitting where Tyler had left him, watching the road. Not agitated, not whining, just watching, as if confirming that the departure was real and the direction was final. After a moment, he turned his head and looked at Nolan. "Come here." English, the language Echo had learned to trust over 10 days in a kennel in the Ozarks, from a man who sat in mud and waited and didn't reach. Echo stood, walked to Nolan, slowly, deliberately, with the unhurried gait of an animal making a decision that he intended to keep. He sat down beside Nolan on the steps, close, shoulder against Nolan's thigh, not pressing, not leaning, just there, present. He said your name means you always come back. Echo looked at him, dark eyes, steady. The kind of steady that doesn't come from training. It comes from deciding. "All right," Nolan said. "Then stay." Echo lowered his chin, slowly,
with the gravity of a thing being placed rather than dropped. He set it on Nolan's boot, the left one, the one above the knee that didn't work right. His breath was warm against the leather. His body was still. His eyes stayed open, watching the yard, the fence, the road, the world beyond the world that had tried to take everything and had, in the end, taken nothing that mattered. The kennel lights came on behind them, the automatic timer that Nolan had set and forgotten about. Warm light spilling through the windows onto the gravel, the steps, the man and the dog sitting together in the last of the morning mist. The Ozark Hills stretched out ahead of them, green and quiet and unhurried. The creek ran somewhere below, making the sound that water makes when it has nowhere particular to be and all the time to get there. Nolan sat there. Echo sat beside him. Neither of them moved. There was nothing to run from. There was nothing to fix. There was only this: a step, a boot, a chin, a morning. A man who had spent 20 years saving people and had finally, after all of it, been saved by a dog who chose him. Good boy. Echo's tail moved. Once, slow, then still.